Good evening, everyone. Ooh, wonderful. My name is Sophia Naflawi, author event coordinator here at the Pratt Library, and thank you for joining us. First, some general housekeeping. Tonight's program will be 45-minute talk, 15-minute Q&A, and then signing at the table on your right, my left, at the end of the program. Snug Books is our bookselling partner this evening. If you have not purchased your copy, after the program is your next point of contact with our bookseller. So again, signing will be at the end of the program. You get a book, you like to get it signed, now's your time. And so now, tonight's program. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Clara Bingham to the Pratt Library to discuss her book, The Movement. The Movement is the first oral history of the decade that built the modern feminist movement. Through the captivating individual voices of the people who lived it, the movement tells the intimate inside story of what it felt like to be at the forefront of the modern feminist crusade, when women rejected thousands of years of custom and demanded the freedom to be who they wanted and needed to be. Clara Bingham will be joined in conversation this evening by Baltimore Beat Editor-in-Chief Lisa Snowden-McCrae. Clara Bingham is an award-winning journalist and the author of Witness to the Revolution, Women on the Hill, and the co-writer of Class Action. A former Washington, D.C. correspondent for Newsweek, her writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, The Guardian, The Daily Beast, and others. Lisa Snowden-McCrae is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Baltimore Beat. She is a former editor at the Baltimore Sun, Baltimore City Paper, and Real News Network. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including Essence, The Washington Post, and Baltimore Magazine. A starred review from Publishers Weekly called The Movement a stunning oral history of the era's women's rights movement. Readers will be electrified. And the New York Times wrote, rollicking good fun. In this deftly arranged collection of remembrances, anecdotes, explications, and arguments, the 10 years leading up to the Roe v. Wade decision were downright exhilarating. It is my great pleasure to welcome Clara Bingham and Lisa Snowden-McCrae.
Welcome, everybody. I wanted to start off actually with a little quote. It's a Baldwin quote. It says, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read." And I think at a time such as this, while we are checking our phones and maybe wailing and gnashing our teeth or pulling out our hair, we remember that this was not the first tumultuous time in our country's history. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I'm so grateful for the work that you've put into creating this book.
Thank you, Lisa. And also just want to say thank you to the wonderful Baltimore Public Library for having me and for having you as my moderator, whose work I respect so much. It's all about local journalism right now. It's so important. And you're really
Thank you. So for those who might not have read the book yet, but will be buying, can you talk a little bit about what's in the book and how it's set up? Because it's a little bit different.
So it's an oral history, and which means that it's all in first-person voice. And I only appear as the writer in introductions and footnotes, and so it reads sort of like a conversation. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do that for this particular history is the personal was political during women's liberation movement, and everyone was having their own political transformation, and everyone had different
So, two things. Well, we're calling a little bit of an audible on the way that things usually go. One of the things that Clara wanted us is to, if there's anybody who, while we're talking, you know, has a memory, something that you want to share, from your own past, please feel free to kind of raise your hand and share.
We can have our own consciousness raising group, but
Yes.
let's wait till maybe a little bit later
A little
on.
bit later?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do
Yeah,
that.
sort of during Q&A or just
Okay,
before
Q&A.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Don't hold back.
As a journalist, I'm thinking about like reading these stories, they felt alive. Like it felt like I was almost at like a kitchen table with these women and they're sharing their memories. Um, but I'm also thinking from the technical standpoint, like how do you do this? I feel like if I even had this idea, I would immediately be like, I'm not, because it just feels like such a giant task. Some of the women are still alive, but that means tracking them down and getting them to speak. Some of them are not alive, and that means that you're doing research or maybe talking to friends or family. How did you go about the work of getting these voices on paper?
Well, it was definitely a big project. I interviewed 120 women between the ages of 75 and 95. And I first started with a chronology of events and then tried to figure out who were the players in those events and who were the activists. I wanted people who were on the ground. I didn't talk to historians and pundits. I wanted to talk to people who were making change, who were on the sidewalk, who were writing the manifestos. And so it really would be one person led to another, led to another, led to another. But it was a reporting job, just like any other one. I'd get on Facebook and try to, find people on Facebook. Or once, if I interviewed one person, then I'd get at least 4 or 5 names from them. And because people were older, it worked to my advantage because a lot of them were retired and they had time to talk. And many of them, at the beginning, I started doing this in 2019. And so I went to people's apartments. I traveled around the country, and many people had boxes of their files that they were getting ready to give to archives. So I could sort of mill through their photos and their memos, and that was really, really great stuff to have. And then COVID came, and I had to start moving my interviews to Zoom, which wasn't as exciting in a lot of ways, but it also was really efficient. And so I could talk to someone in Arizona one day and talk to someone in LA another day. But it was really the people who I went out and met that moved me the most, and the connections became really strong because everyone had such amazing stories to tell. And there were rarely interviews without tears. And I still remember a few of my favorite ones. Like there's a woman named Frances Beale in the book who I credit her with beginning the concept of intersectionality. She was a black civil rights activist, and she was working at SNCC in New York, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she started to realize that a lot of the men she was working with were very sexist. And she started her own group of women inside SNCC, and eventually they started having meetings, and then eventually they wrote this very important manifesto called Being Black and a Woman, Double Jeopardy, and which was really important. And that came out in 1969. And I went out to Oakland to interview a few other women. I could never find Frances Beale. She wasn't listed. I couldn't get her email. She wasn't on Facebook. And so I'd sort of I knew she was still alive, but she was in her 80s. So I was interviewing one woman, and it was the day before I left. I had my flight the next morning, and I said, "Do you know Frances Beale?" And I can't find her. And she said, "Oh, yeah." And she picked up the phone. and I went straight to the nursing home where Frances Beale was, and she was not very mobile, but she had all of her marbles. And which is, of course, the perfect kind of person to interview because they can't get away from you. And so I had the best, 4 hours with her of her telling me everything about her life and how she wrote that manifesto, how she got to that point in her life. And so it was just hearing all these personal stories that were so moving. And then another of my other favorite one is I went to Gloucester, Mass to interview Bobby Gibb, who was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. And she did it illegally in 1966. And she jumped out of a bush because women were not allowed to run the marathon. Their doctors said that their uterus would fall out if they ran more than 1.5 miles.
Okay.
So women only could play half-court basketball. Only 9% of college athletes were women. There were no college scholarships for women. So women were completely cut out of sports, essentially. And Bobby was a runner. She loved running. She was from Boston. And so she trained in nurse shoes because those are the only shoes that were wide enough and had enough kind of cushion. Of course, there were no running shoes for women. And she jumped out of a bush. She ran the whole marathon. When she got to Wellesley, which is an important part of that halfway through of the marathon, all the Wellesley students had heard on the radio that a woman was running in the marathon, and they came out in droves and started crying and singing Ave Maria. And Bobby said, oh, this is when she realized she wasn't just doing this for her. She was doing this for her entire gender, to prove that women actually could be strong and could have endurance and could fight and could be who they wanted to be. This was really not just about politics. It was about women being able to self-actualize, to be able to know what their talents were and go after them. So interviews like that were really exciting. But then I just wove them all together. I had thousands of pages of transcripts, and it was my husband Joe was sitting in front of, it was a little brutal. So it was a hard thing, but I wanted it to read like a conversation. And in a way, I feel like, especially in these days with our attention spans being so much shorter, telling history through oral history it's sort of history light. It's not really dense. There's not a lot of analysis, but it's more emotionally kind of real and palatable, and so it puts you in the room. And so I love telling history this way. I think it's accessible.
It's such a difference between a journalist, I think, and an academic, because
Exactly.
journalists want to disappear out of the story, where academics, I think, are kind of right there, and they're like, here's all the facts crammed into the sentence.
Yeah, and then you fall asleep really quickly.
So you do talk a lot in the book about how some stories were easier to find than others, because when we think about feminism, we think about mostly white women. The work that Black women, Latina women, Indigenous women, all of those people did was not on the forefront in the way that white women's work was highlighted. So can you talk a little bit about maybe like the extra work that you had to do, or the way that you had to kind of create something that was equitable when you talked about this whole fight and made sure that to highlight everybody?
I felt really strongly about that. I mean, this movement has always been considered a white women's movement, and I knew that going in. But here's an interesting anecdote to that. When I asked Gloria Steinem if she would give me an interview, she said only if you interview at least 20 Black women first. And she always had that attitude, even in the late 60s, early 70s, because she was so frustrated by how the mainstream media at that point, entirely white male media, never paid attention to the Black women who were in the trenches with Gloria Steinem and other white women all along, because they were just racist and weren't interested. They liked, Gloria was beautiful, and so she was someone that people always covered. And if you think of it, the media then was the first, the first iteration of history. And that's what we all go back to, what was in the newspapers, who was covered on television. And So there was a natural bias already going on. And so Gloria, I remember Gloria would get calls from journalists saying, we'd like a quote. And she would say, no, why don't you ask, X, Y, and Z? Why don't you ask Florence Kennedy? Why don't you ask other women who are just as involved in this movement as I am, but they happen to be black and they're not like beautiful white women who went to Smith. And so she was always pushing that angle, and it was great because it also forced me, I wanted to do this, but it wasn't as easy for me to find the black women who weren't as well known and get them to talk to me. And so that was my main goal. And it was amazing what I found. I mean, I interviewed all sorts of women from all different parts of the movement. Many of them had died, sadly, and I had to find their archives. Like Florence Kennedy, who was this amazing civil rights lawyer, unfortunately died she was older than a lot of these women, and she died way before I could interview her, but I was scrounging for all of her interviews that she did with radio and television, finding oral history interviews that she did. She wrote a memoir. There was a biography written of her. So I was just, but it was just not as easy as it should have been to find her, voice. She led so many of the protests. She gave speeches all the time with Gloria Steinem. And what I found in general with the black women who were leaders in this movement, there was Florence Kennedy, there was Pauli Murray, who was the legal architect of the movement. Ruth Bader Ginsburg considered her the foremother of the whole legal part of the feminist movement, and she accredited a lot of her early cases to Pauli Murray, who was a queer, trans, black woman from North Carolina who was a brilliant legal scholar. She went to Howard Law School, only woman in her class in 1944, and there she suffered extreme sexism. And suddenly, it was the first time in her life she had realized that, because she'd always been fighting for civil rights, and it was all about race for her because she grew up in Jim Crow South. And suddenly all of the male professors at Howard told her that she shouldn't be there, and why was she taking the place of a man? She graduated first in her class. And she gave Betty Friedan the idea of starting NOW. So she was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women in 1966. And then Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is now still a member of Congress from DC, she worked at the ACLU, and she was a badass civil rights lawyer. So what was important about this movement is it came out of the civil rights movement. And a lot of the white women who were in the movement were also started in the civil rights movement and had worked in Mississippi in '64. Most of the early members of the white members of the movement were in the civil rights movement. So in a way, it was a perfect storm between the women who learned how to organize in the South, and then the Vietnam War happened by later in the 60s. So a lot of women were working in the anti-war movement, and they ended up leaving because there was so much sexism from their comrades in arms, for these men who they were fighting for equality and social justice with them, but of course they didn't really believe in women having that too. So a lot of these women, whether they're black or white, were very good at organizing, and they came together and worked really closely together. But at the same time, this is the first generation of people who were integrating colleges. Now, I interviewed Barbara Smith, who later became really important thinker and intellectual, and she for black women's literature mostly, and she was the first class of women at Holyoke, and of black women at Holyoke, and she was from Cleveland, and her mother and aunt and grandmother were all domestics, and she and her twin sister got a really good education, and it was just at the beginning of when these colleges were starting to integrate. So they were able to she was able to go to Holyoke, and she took off from there. So there was a lot of discomfort. People didn't know each other very well racially. Yeah. And a lot of black women who I interviewed didn't want to have anything to do with the feminist movement because they thought it was white. And also, it was the era of Black Power, and which was very macho, and it was considered for a lot of the women I interviewed felt that they were betraying their men and betraying their race if they joined the white women's movement. So it was there's a lot of nuance to it.
That's a good point, I think, to bring us into the present, because we're sitting here. We are, what, I think, in our second month of Trump's presidency, and figuring out how that happened, what happened. And as you're talking about kind of this intersection between the civil rights movement, what it did for Black folks and what it did for white women, there's been a conversation among people that I know, especially Black people that I know, that as Trump kind of has been snatching away a lot of like DEI, or at least taking hits at a lot of DEI protections, a lot of the Black people that I see are like, that doesn't really have anything to do with me anyway. That never really helped me as a Black person. That helped white women. And it's sometimes white women seeing like, oh, like that, maybe some of them that even voted for Trump, saying, oh, wait, that's my job. So I didn't know, like, I guess for you, having this in your brain and watching everything that's unfolding in our country, do you see parallels? Do you see kind of like some of the work that these people did unraveling in specific ways?
Well, that's a big question.
Sorry.
I mean, the first one is reproductive rights is the most basic one. And I was writing a chapter on abortion war stories, essentially, when the Dobbs decision came down in June of 2022. And that really blew me away because I'd been so steeped in how horrible and how hard life was for almost every woman I interviewed had multiple abortions. That was the shocker to me. It wasn't just one. And everyone, people gone to Japan and Puerto Rico and London and Harlem and, back alleys all over the place risking their lives. And that was just a regular course of action for most women. And so to see that rolled back was so shocking. And what I realized too is that people didn't remember what it was like, and that's just it. It's like that was 50 years ago. It was 55 years ago. It was 60, 70 years ago. So for the, latest 20, 2 or 3 generations, that history, which is pretty recent, but not recent enough, isn't on the forefront of people's minds. And so it's sort of now the same with DEI, and taking affirmative action for granted, taking diversity for granted, thinking, well, it's not going to affect me. I mean, it was put in place for a reason because there was a lot of racism out there and sexism out there. And, maybe it went too far, and cancel culture, I think, went too far. But there's always a reason why the pendulum swings a certain way. And I always think it's so important to understand why, before reacting. And so now so much is unraveling, and it's really scary. And just figuring out what is the part that affects you or your values the most, and how you want to fight it and how you want to protest it, I think is a really important moment for all of us. It's a real reckoning.
In some ways, it feels like we kind of all went to sleep.
Yeah.
Like we got very lazy. Lazy's not the right word, but you know what I mean? Like we just kind of took things for granted. Like that was always how it was going to be.
Right. Well, once you figure you have a Supreme Court case that, if that is going to allow a human right, essentially, for women, you never would think, well, who's going to go after it? But of course, we were asleep. And we didn't realize that there has always been a very strong, small movement out there who wanted to undermine Roe v. Wade from the get-go, from the very beginning.
Another group of folks I've been thinking about lately is the women that have kind of emerged in this time period to make some of the things, some of those rights go away. Um, Amy Coney Barrett, that was kind of why she was put there. But even if you think about the social media that we ingest, like there's this movement, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like trad wives. So there's these mostly very young, I don't think any of them are over the age of 30, very thin, very beautiful, mostly white, but not always white, influencers. So they're like, my child wanted gummy bears, so I'm like hand making gummy bears for my kid, or I'm packing my lunch for my husband. And the goal is to find a man to take care of these women, and they stay in these homes where if you look at the home, clearly both people are working because it's like Beyonce's refrigerator in the background, or like, so like, what do you think? You've immersed yourself in these women that really fought to get us all right, to get us all free. But there are also these women that are working on the other side.
I mean, they make me crazy, the trad wives. But first of all, feminism is all about giving women choices. So it isn't saying you have to do one thing or the other. And so I think that's really important. That just so everyone can do what they want to do, that's what matters. And of course, if you want to be a traditional wife, that's fantastic. Especially if you can marry someone who can support you. But the trad wives have basically turned the idea of being a traditional wife into a business. And that's the kind of hypocrisy of it, because they're making a lot of money. And they're being, they are obviously, there's a lot of product placement, and because they're influencers, they're given a huge amount of money the more followers they get. But what they're doing is they're espousing this completely reactionary concept, which is that women, and it's, in a way, I think it comes from the idea that actually it's really hard doing it all. It's really hard having a job and having a family and having a husband, and it would be a hell of a lot easier to not have to worry about at least the job part. And if someone's taking care of you and you can take care of the kids, then great. But what we know is that doesn't always work out so well. Your husband might lose his job. He might die. He might leave you, and then suddenly what do you have? Do you have an education? Do you have any skills? Can you go into the workplace? And this has affected so many women over the generations, that this sort of utopian idea that you can not need to worry about your education or having any job skills is just, might work for 5% of the lucky, white women out there who have lots of endorsements. But it's just not realistic. And it's pretty messianic. I mean, the idea is to really convince followers that this is how you want to live. And I mean, they make their own everything. They have no babysitters. They have 8 children. They make it seem so great and easy. There's the one who lives out in Montana who has, practices natural childbirth. And you're just waiting for things to go wrong. But everything seems to be perfect. And so glorifies what is essentially a really powerless and utopian and unrealistic lifestyle that I think is really dangerous. And because it forgets the fact that back when women had no other choice but to do that, that was all there was for women. And by glorifying this sort of very old-fashioned concept of gender differences, I just think it's incredibly, ultimately kind of dangerous.
Is there an antidote?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, everything else. The 128 women members of Congress. We at least even have a female attorney general. She might not be for reproductive rights, but there are a lot of women out there who have a lot of power still, and we did have a woman run for president who won 48.3% of the popular vote. So she's, another important role model. So it's just about everyone doing what they can do.
Are there any organizers, activists, journalists that you're kind of watching right now? Not assigning you another book, but if you were to write, are there any people that you're like that person would go in my next book?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by all of the reproductive rights organizations who are fighting on the ground in all the banned states, and the banned states, I think, are living. The women there are living under Jane Crow, and it's very scary. And there are a lot of on the ground abortion funds that help women get out of the states, that help women get medical abortions, and who are fighting legally, like the Center for Reproductive Rights that's based in New York has lawsuits all over in Texas and Georgia and Louisiana. They're representing this amazing doctor in New York who is being sued by both Texas and Louisiana, and they want to bring her into both of those states and lock her up for sending abortion medication to women in Texas and Louisiana. So, and the Center for Reproductive Rights is supporting her. So there's a major battle going on in the banned states that is really serious, and it's life and death. There's so many women who are dying now just for having miscarriages that are not being treated. And also, there are fewer residents who want to go and work in hospitals and train in hospitals in banned states. And Idaho only has one OBGYN for high-risk pregnancies, the entire state, because people don't want to go and practice there. So, I mean, the trickle-down effect of Dobbs is for women's health is very extreme. So that I love the heads of all of these organizations who I think are just freedom fighters right now.
Yeah, I know for we've done stories in the beat about how, Maryland is still accessible, but we have to be prepared for the folks that are coming in, so it makes it less actually accessible because we're servicing more folks.
Right. So you have to worry about being able to service who's local, and then you're right here on the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, and same with Virginia. There you all are right on the border. I mean, in West Virginia, it's illegal. It's illegal everywhere south. So it's important for the border states to be able to help women. And New York has had a huge influx of women flying in, too.
I also appreciate you referencing Jane Crow, Jim Crow, because I think a lot of folks, when they talk about this moment, they talk about Nazi Germany, but they don't always know that the Nazis were taking notes from this country.
So true. Yeah, they were studying Jim Crow.
Yep.
They really were.
We have a little bit of time left, and I thought with what we have left, we could talk about the Baltimore reference in your book. I know you said that there was a Goucher professor that you write about.
Yeah, so Baltimore comes up. Baltimore has strong women's liberation group and multiple groups, I think. And there's one woman, she is no longer alive, so I found out her story through her archives. But her name was Florence Howe, and she was a professor, literature professor at Goucher for many years. And she taught Western literature. And in 1970, one of her students said, "Are there any women on our reading list?" And she was like, "Oh, I guess not." And she'd only been teaching white male writers, and she suddenly realized this is absolutely ridiculous. There must be women who wrote something that's, important. And and this was going on all over the country. There's one of the parts of this story that I find so fascinating is women rediscovering their history. And a lot of artists did that. Judy Chicago did that she was a California feminist artist who started the first women feminist art class at Cal Arts. And she got students to go into the library and find out, were there Renaissance women painters? Actually, there were, that no one had ever heard of. And they got a whole registry together of all of the women painters and artists for over the centuries that no one had ever heard of then, because there were no books about it. and European history books had nothing about women. So Florence Howe started the Feminist Press, and it published all sorts of books by women and about women that had never been published before. And they literally had a printing press in Baltimore, and it was based here for a long time. It's now, and it still exists, it's in New York. But she published with Alice Walker, the Zora Neale Hurston reader that Alice Walker had put together. Zora Neale Hurston was another example of discovering Alice Walker, who was teaching women's literature and started to wonder, let's start teaching some Black women's literature. And she was at one of the colleges up. She was not at Smith, but I think at Wellesley, teaching that. And she rediscovered Zora Neale Hurston. All of her books were out of print. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance and a brilliant, actually, anthropologist.
Like actually revolutionary.
From Columbia. She was like teaching and studying anthropology at Columbia while writing Their Eyes Are Watching God and all of her incredible books. And Alice Walker was trying to find her descendants. She wanted to republish her books that were all out of print. And Florence Howe was going to all sorts of bookstores all around this area trying to find Zora Neale Hurston books that she could find in secondhand bookstores. Very hard to find. And it turned out Zora Neale Hurston was buried in an unmarked grave in Florida, and had just been completely forgotten. She had died impoverished and was a domestic. So that was an example of how someone with that incredible talent, because she was a Black woman, was getting no credit, and none of the curriculums ever taught her until these women brought her back. So that story. So the Feminist Press was a really important part of the beginning of women's studies.
Also, it's just like so remarkable how like one little domino knocks over so many other dominoes and creates big change, which is important.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. And now I have to go and find some more Zora Neale Hurston.
Yes, exactly. Sure. Find her. So does anyone in this room, was anyone in this room involved in women's liberation or experienced discrimination when they were younger, during this time period, that they might like to share about? And if not, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but sometimes it's kind of fun when that happens.
Yes. Wow.
And what she told me when I met her was that the professors would walk into the room, locate her so that they knew exactly where she was sitting, so that they could walk over to her and turn their backs on her. Amazing. Oh my God. Wow. Wow.
So for our audience at home,
Thank you for sharing that.
that was a story about a woman who was the first Black woman at the University of Maryland School of Nursing, who Thurgood Marshall had to argue for her to attend the school. This was in the 50s.
Amazing. Any questions? Talk about the ERA. So the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, was, first of all, just so everyone knows, women are not mentioned in the Constitution at all. So in 1923, Alice Paul, who was a suffragette, thought, well, the best way to kind of follow up on winning the vote is to have women recognized in the Constitution as equal, citizens. So she was the first person to write the ERA and to get it introduced into Congress in 1923. It was then introduced almost every year after that, but never got any attention at all, and essentially was dying on the vine until the second wave women resurrected it. And in 19 72, it passed the House and the Senate after much, much debate with huge majorities. And so it was very much a bipartisan bill.
Attention. The library will be closing in 15 minutes.
That scared me.
The library will be closing in 15 minutes.
Finish up. So the thing that's amazing is that it passed the House and the Senate, and I could look up the exact numbers, but maybe there were 10 senators who voted against it. And it was a expected thing that you would be for equal rights for women and putting in the Constitution. And of course, back then there was still lots of debate of, does this mean women will have to go immediately into the military? Does this mean women won't get alimony? And so there were a lot of hearings in the House and the Senate, and lots of statistics were put out there, and the women's movement was very organized around getting it passed first in Congress, which they succeeded, and then it had to go to the states for ratification. It needed 2/3 of the states, 38 states, and the first 2 years they were off and running, and they were down to only 5 states. So at the beginning, it was just obviously it was going to happen. And then Phyllis Schlafly turned up, and I consider her sort of the beginning of the disinformation campaign that we're living with now. And she brilliantly took this topic and turned it on its nose and accused the people who were for women's liberation as being anti-family, lesbians who hated men, and that women would go immediately into the front lines, that bathrooms would be co-ed, that women, it wouldn't be safe for women to be housewives anymore, that they would never get alimony, their husbands wouldn't pay for them. I mean, it was an absolute fear campaign. And she was so smart. She was actually never had been involved in women's issues before. She was from St. Louis, and she'd run for Congress. She was very politically ambitious. She was a national security expert, but she noticed that this topic was a sort of hot button topic that she could use to her political advantage. And she rallied housewives in all the states that still needed to ratify. And she got them to bake bread and go and give them to all the members of Congress. And she gave cover, because of course the state legislatures were entirely men who were voting for this. And so once Phyllis Schlafly said, oh, actually, let's not do this, and it's not good for women, and got enough women to, of course, agree with her too, they weren't able to get ratification. And they extended the deadline to 1982, and then sadly they lost. And so it's sad because the movement put all of its eggs into that basket, thinking that if you could just have the ERA, it would fix everything else, which it really would have. But by putting all of their organizing energy into ratifying the constitutional amendment, they then lost that and sort of didn't gain a lot more because of it. So it was a crushing blow. And President Biden, in the last 3 days of his presidency, declared it a constitutional amendment, and that it really, because we now have all 38 of those states. They've now, in retrospect, gone back, voted for it, but it was past the deadline, of course. And so it's a legal question of whether or not it really is a constitutional amendment, and it probably isn't, and it will probably be challenged in court. So it's sort of in this weird limbo right now. And it's a really sad story. That's why I'm glad I finished the book in 1973. It's a much happier time. Oh, I have another Maryland story. Title IX also started at the University of Maryland. This amazing woman named Bunny Sanders, who was a graduate student, University of Maryland. She in psychology. Bernie Sanders. She got her master's, wanted to teach. There were a bunch of openings, and all of her male colleagues and classmates got those jobs. And she was told when she interviewed, she couldn't get the job because she was too outspoken. And she, of course, thought she was just she wasn't behaving correctly. And her husband was like, no, that's sexism. This is terrible. She went into all the civil rights laws and found that you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race or sex if you receive federal funding for universities and colleges. She contacted Congresswoman Edith Green, who was a really old woman from Oregon, who was a former teacher and head of a subcommittee on the education department. And they got together along with another women's group called WHEEL and started suing colleges one by one. She got 350 colleges who she was able to prove were discriminating against women. Women were completely shut out of academia. There were maybe 5% of tenured professors were women, usually just in the art history department or maybe in English. So women just couldn't get jobs. And so they got Title IX to the Education Act passed in 1972. And it was all because of Bernie Sanders. Really, it was such a Sandler. It was such a kind of random story. And she also had died before I could get to her, but she had given a bunch of interesting long interviews about this process that we now take for granted. And of course, it's a 38-word amendment, and it mentions not just women in education, but women's educational activities, which means sports. And at the time, not that many people were very aware of the fact that Title IX meant equality in sports. But by the time, about 10 years later, it kicked in after the NCAA fought it. But so now women really did have, now we get funding. They're $200,000 a year is given towards women's sports scholarships. Because of this one University of Maryland graduate student.
Amazing. Any other?
Thank you to both of you. My question is about, a couple times you said that like the women in the movement were very organized, like you said that like 3 or 4 times. And I guess I'm wondering if you could just like speak about the culture of like meetings and like building relationships and how they communicated. Like what was the culture? Like how did they handle disagreements? How did they handle just like building relationships? And because like all these women sound like they came from very different backgrounds and stories, and so like bringing people together and staying very organized is like hard to do. So if you don't mind just like
Well, I would say the thing that they had was they started consciousness raising groups, and they were incredibly powerful. And women would meet once a week, so in groups of 10 to 20, and talk about their personal lives. And then they would expand that into their political feelings. And consciousness raising groups just went all over the country like wildfire. Everyone had them. People had multiple ones. Every city and town in America had women getting together in person. And then there were so many women's liberation groups. New York had one like every other block. And if one would break off and then start another one, and there were huge amounts of disagreements. And the left eats itself, which is really a terrible thing, and that was certainly the case with women's liberation. There was a lot of division. There was a lot of rancor. But at the beginning, there was such a big enemy to defeat that there was a lot. At the beginning, there was pretty much common ground. And because they had organizational skills in terms of knowing how, for example, the first women's liberation protest was at the Miss America pageant in 1968 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And all of the women who were out there were used guerrilla theater because they knew that was a good way to get press attention. And they had all been involved in the anti-war movement. So they had lambs, lambs for slaughter that symbolized the women who were, on stage. And they had funny signs, and they went inside and unfurled a huge banner that said women's liberation. And so they were very funny, and they got a lot of attention for that and got huge amounts of press, which spread the word. And after that, the movement really kind of got moving very fast. So a lot of it was sort of electric, but it was also meeting in person. And that's what worries me about the generation now, that we need your generation to really take up this mantle. And because of social media, there's this sense of the campfire and everyone communicating, but it doesn't have the power of meeting in person, which I think was really strong, back in the 60s and 70s. That was really hard. It's like killing your children. And I actually had to cut the entire book in half. My manuscript was twice as long. It was heartbreaking. There are many chapters that I loved that didn't make it in. And my editor had to mostly help me do that, along with my husband, Joe. And so it's very hard. Because they were all good. But there were some interviews, there's some people who could tell a story, and those were the people who I loved. And if they could tell the story of what it really felt like to do what they were doing, it would usually jump off the page. And so I was always looking for storytellers. And even if their stories weren't as dramatic, but they told it really well, often they'd make the cut.